Welcome to the Leverage Your Potential podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Director and Assistant Director of Menlo College's Office of Internships, Career Services, and Study Abroad, Dylan Hoole and Kelly Davis, in partnership with Menlo's Content Creation Club. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Leverage Your Potential, Menlo College's Career Services podcast. I am your host today, Kelly Davis, Assistant Director of Career Services and Study Abroad, and I'm very happy to bring on my colleague, Mr. Erik Bakke. Erik, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you for the invite, Kelly. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. So Erik Bakke is our Senior Director of Student and Academic Support, and within that role, he does many things here at Menlo College. So I'm going to let Erik go ahead and introduce himself. Erik, tell us about you and your role here at Menlo.
Okay, yes, the Senior Director of Student Academic Support title doesn't really tell you much, except that I'm the Director of SAS. Other than that,
I should have muted myself for that.
In that role, I direct the Writing Center portion of the Writing and Oral Communication Center. And I also direct the Intensive English program, and I founded that program in 2013. And then in recent years, the last couple of years, I've been helping manage a grant from the Department of Education. And so as part of this, I work with others to manage the labs for the 100 level classes. Those would be English 100 and Math 100. And there are other grant funded projects that we work on. Like e-portfolios for students. And of course, there are other things I do as well, but I think that's a good starting point.
Definitely. And it was right after I had started that you and Angela and the other members of that team had received that grant. And I remember it was a very big deal because it is, absolutely. But I also want to say it was very inspiring as your colleague. It also made me feel like in my position, I too could apply for grants, which is not something I'd ever considered. So
please do.
Yes, definitely. So thanks for giving us kind of that all-encompassing description of what your role is, because you do, as we like to say here, wear many hats. So, but now let's go back into you, Erik, and we're going to go back in time a little bit. I'd love for you to share with our audience and with me what your bachelor's degree was in and how you ended up deciding on that major for yourself.
Okay, so my bachelor's degree was in English, but I began my bachelor's degree studies in physics, which I don't know if you knew.
I did not know that.
And that came out of, I was interested in math and science in high school and did well, thought why not. And I've retained an interest in science, but somewhere around my second year of college, of undergrad, I realized my heart just wasn't in it. So even though I still enjoy physics as a topic, I, at that time, decided I wanted to spend more time working on making art and writing. And I was at a public school, a UC in California, so there was a limit on how many units I could take. So I wasn't in a position, since I was switching, to be able to do a minor or a second major. So what I did was decide, okay, I've been taking art classes, that's great, I'll continue to take art classes, but I'll get my degree in English. And part of the decision was that the school had a very good English department and I needed help in writing. I figured that's where I would learn the most. So English became my degree.
That's quite the switch from physics to English. And I can imagine at any institution, it's very difficult to go from, well, maybe easier going from physics to English than the other way around, but still.
Probably.
The sciences tend to have just so many requirements and such a clear defined pathway in their degrees, whereas English, I feel like you've got a little bit more flexibility. Do you still read books on physics, or how do you kind of engage still with that physics piece?
So I listen to, just popular science programs like Scientific American, podcast, and Science Friday. And I read, I'll read the odd book here and there, and not so much journal articles, but just articles published in the popular media. So I try to keep up, but what's difficult, I think what's difficult for science writers is the math is so complex in physics, and it's so specialized that to have a deep understanding, you really need to have a deep background in the math. And I don't have that, so I just stick to what I can understand.
Sure, absolutely. I know someone who's trying to write a not science fiction, but somewhere in that vein novel. There's a lot of math involved, a lot of understanding how planets interact with the rest of the galaxy and all sorts of things. But that's really neat. So you then went on eventually to pursue your master's degree, and this is where you and I share an alma mater. But what was your master's degree also in English?
No, my master's degree is in fine art, and specifically, the focus was on installation art. Was in somewhere in the name of it, but it was through the Department of Education at NYU, and it ended up being, well, my focus was on painting, but it was also a degree that involved an art theory component. So many of my classes had nothing to do with studio art. They had to do with the literature of theory of the time, critical theory.
So how much of a break was there between your bachelor's and master's degree?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. I have to do a little math here. We're back to that. There was about 4 years.
Okay. And what happened in between and eventually led you going back to getting specifically an MFA?
Yes, and I should be clear for those listening carefully. NYU did not have an MFA at that time, so it was an MA. So.
And I just assumed because I heard Master of Fine Arts, didn't I?
I don't know we can go back and listen to the tape and see what I said. But I'm careful about that because people are covetous of their letters.
Sure. Yeah.
Anyway, I worked for a bit, and then I got a job in Japan teaching. So I was teaching in Japan for a bit, and I was teaching English to Japanese students. And then I moved to Poland, and I was in Poland working at Adam Mickiewicz University, also teaching English. And then I was also practicing as an artist at that time, and I wanted to complete, at least to get a graduate level degree in art. And NYU had a program in Venice, and that wasn't so far away from Poland. So I was able to start my master's degree by spending 2 summers in Venice studying, and then eventually went to New York.
All right, I've got a bunch of questions now because we're getting into that global part that I did not know about. So this is really interesting. First, did you go through a program when you typically, especially there are many programs like this in Japan for teaching. So did you go through a program, and if so, which one?
I did not. I was working for a private language school, and the owner of the school had connections in Osaka. And it was through those connections with another school in Osaka that I received this offer.
Wow. So how do you get yourself hired in Japan and then in Poland? What's the secret?
What was the connection? At that time, I had I was in a relationship, and the other person was from Poland. And so that was just a move of that kind to Poland. And then the work came afterwards. Once I got there, I looked for work.
All right. So it is not what you know, but who you know. To some extent.
In that case, probably 98%, yes.
and I didn't know that NYU had these programs in Venice. Sometimes they're more specific programs in smaller, well, Venice is not small, but where they don't have kind of
Mm-hmm.
their global campuses that are lesser known. They're only known for if you happen to be in that department. Were you in Venice for the entire duration of your MA, or was it just part of it?
No, there were 2 summers. So I went one summer and then I went the following summer. And then I went to New York and I finished off there. And I don't quite know how the units spread out for the masters, but probably about an equal amount of time in New York. And then I just lived there after that for 13 years. So.
And how was living in New York? What brought you out to the Bay Area?
Well, I grew up out here in the Bay Area. And New York, since I have a deep interest in fine art, has been and continues to be much more of a center for art than San Francisco Bay Area. Los Angeles now has a very active arts community. Well, not today, but
Nowhere does today, unfortunately. Well, maybe
yes,
in our homes, right? That's
yes.
time to be creative.
But if we're thinking about museums and galleries, New York, just a much greater opportunity there than in the San Francisco Bay Area. So I wanted to be in the center of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So now I'm going to kind of make a pivot, and it's funny because New York City is definitely a place where I would associate the adjective, well, or the, actually, I'm about to show how bad at English I am. I don't know if rigor is an adjective. It might not be. Rigorous is the adjective. Sorry. But rigor and applying rigor to everything you do is kind of the topic that we decided on for this conversation today. And you
Which
definitely,
I deeply regretted soon after.
after reading the questions. But it's something you certainly need in New York City is a bit of drive. So how would you define rigor then?
Okay, yeah. So after we talked about that, I do think it's a good starting point. But I was trying to think about it in a way that made sense and wasn't just going to lead to some cheap responses. So I started with, well, what isn't? Because when you say rigor, you immediately start to shut down and think, oh no. And what I didn't mean was that if you're working on a job or a project, that you consider it like a static set of tasks, and that every day you have to make sure you check off each of these boxes for each of these tasks. That's not what I had in mind. And I think one way to talk about it is to say that it's approaching things as an active participant and not a passive participant. And so I'll go through maybe some examples that I was thinking of. If you have an entry level position, let's say somewhere, this may be applicable for some students. If you just have in mind that you're punching in and punching out, it's not going to lead anywhere. But if you, even in an entry level position, take time to imagine what could be done to make your job different, your position different, and to make your effectiveness different, that is a kind of application of rigor. And so there are, at root of that, maybe we can go back to kind of a more traditional idea that I think there's certain basics for any project or work that should be, let's say, just like breathing. And that should be, you should be on time all of the time. Silly things like this, but make a huge difference in a work environment. You need to keep on top of your communications. It doesn't matter what you're doing in any field. You need to respond quickly. And particularly important, something that took me a while to learn, if you're sitting on any information that others need, don't get it to them right away, because it actually will make your life a lot easier and allow other people to do work that you don't have to do. And as part of this, again, talking about it in a more traditional sense, use your calendar, don't double book, say no if you have to. And if you did say yes, be there. But, and interject anytime, Kelly. And I'll wake you up to ask a question if I see you go to sleep. But I do have some other ways I want to talk about this. And one is that your goal shouldn't be to be a good employee in life. If we're talking about a job, you should just be perceived as a good employee because your life is in balance and you've thought about where you want to be and what you want to do. So I'd like to talk a little bit about rigor as being part of making sure your life is in balance. And that means all the things you hear all the time but don't necessarily make sense to you until you have a problem with them. And these can be things like your physical and mental health. Make sure that you're doing okay. I've traveled quite a bit and I've lived in different places. And once for a while, I was living in South Carolina, and I worked for a lawyer who specialized in mediation on big projects like dams, multi-million-dollar projects. And he was hired when things were going wrong. And he said something that struck me once. He said that, when you get to the root of it, often when these big projects go sideways, it's not because there's a problem in the design of the project or in the contracts. It's usually has to do with someone whose life has fallen apart, and that's impacted the ability for the project to go forward. And so these can be, problems with mental health. They can be problems with the relationships, problems with substance abuse. So when I talk about rigor and then talk about balance, it's part of just taking stock of where you are. And, of course, it's easy to say these things, but when you're in the middle of, let's say, a bad relationship, you kind of have to take care of it. You're not going to be able to do well on other things. Or if you're having problems with substance abuse, you probably need to get help, or it's going to catch up with you. Everything we know, but we don't always think about when we think about being rigorous about our work.
Yeah, I think that what I'm hearing from your definition is essentially applying ourselves and applying the whole self. And I think that it can be a rigorous process to actually kind of take care of the things that you just mentioned as well. It's not easy to get out of a bad relationship. It's not easy to end substance abuse. But and to keep our lives in balance and in check definitely is kind of the height of being able to present our full selves to our work and apply ourselves. I feel like,
Yes.
Erik, you're advising me right now.
Yes, I did mean these comments in general. I don't know enough about you. Thank goodness, Kelly, to know if this advice would be directed at you. But I'm just thinking about things that I've run into over the years that may not be the first thing that you learn, but things you do learn from experience. And sorry, were you going to say something?
No, please.
Okay. Because I was thinking about also this problem of, how do you do a good job? And I'm thinking about this quite a bit. We can talk more about art-related projects a little bit later, but I'm thinking about this mostly in terms of employment. And I went back to a job I had even when I was working in New York as a writer and as an artist. New York's expensive, so you end up doing all sorts of kinds of work, and that will probably happen. That happens for everybody usually. And I ended up managing operations for a small family-owned business that provided art services to galleries and museums. So it's somehow connected to art, but really it was just a job. And the problem was that the owner was abusive, but not towards me. I have a feeling I was underpaid, so somehow I got off the hook. I didn't think about that clearly enough at the time, but to the majority of employees, he was really horrible. And going back to an expanded notion of rigor, it was clearly wrong what he was doing. That anyone could see that, but also it felt wrong. And I had to take stock. I needed the job, but it wasn't right to be in that environment. So I gave them a warning and I said, it's great working here and all. I need the money. I have to pay rent, but I can't work here if this environment doesn't change. And it didn't change. So I had to quit. And that put me a little bit at a disadvantage because I needed more work on top of the other work I was doing. But I think there are times when you really need to step outside of the job and say, yeah, I'm doing everything great in the job. It's kind of fine for me, but is the context healthy?
Definitely. I think those are wise words. And it's so difficult to find that line for so many people when it becomes unacceptable to work at a place anymore, especially if you're in a position where it is, absolutely necessary for survival, which is the case for so many people. So that's a hard decision. That's a hard decision to make.
You had a question. Has there been a time in life where you did not apply rigor?
If you could have gone back and said all of this now, what would you have done differently? Because how did it turn out?
Yes, I think I have a good example here, and it relates to internships, which is something that
exciting. Yes.
Menlo College provides. So right out of, and I think during a little bit undergraduate, I had an internship at a big, well-known, as far as San Francisco galleries go, a well-known San Francisco gallery. And it was great. And I learned a lot and I did a great job. And there was a lot to see and it was exciting. But there was one moment when, here's the story.
Here we go.
the director of the gallery, not the owner, but the director, who now has a very successful, still has a very successful gallery in San Francisco. He invited me to go to an artist's house. And the artist, one of the more famous living artists in San Francisco. And here's where I don't know what happened. I can't even remember what the reason was, but I assume it was something like a date. I don't know. A barbecue I said I would go to. It's very unclear. I said no. I was busy.
You said no?
I said no. I was busy. And
I'm shocked.
Well, I'm still shocked to this day. I can't even remember the reason why I said no, but it's of course something with an internship. It's what you wait for, is not just the daily tasks and to learn things, but to kind of be invited into the inner circle, right? To be around people who are professionally engaged or deeply engaged in something that interests you. And this artist's work interested me deeply.
Yeah.
The possibility interested me deeply. And they aren't, and this is something that was very clear to me later, that these kinds of opportunities, although variations of them have happened throughout my life, they don't happen that often. Percentage-wise, these opportunities don't happen that often. So kind of the lesson that you're asking about that was, whatever kind of discomfort there would have been in canceling a date or telling people I couldn't go to a barbecue, this should have been weighed on a much longer view. And obviously I should have just canceled whatever I had to do that day. Said, gotta go do this thing. And it may not have led to anything, but it was something I should have done.
Sure. Yeah. I think that it's always difficult to be able to tell, and as shocked as we might be, Erik, I think that your past self deserves some forgiveness. Who knows what was so compelling about the other piece of it? Maybe it was supposed to lead to something more exciting than it ended up leading to. But I think that's a great example, though. I mean, there are things that you want to say no to, but there are some things you absolutely do not want to say no to.
And I guess part of what I want to emphasize here is, it's not that anyone's going to highlight it in, highlighter and underline it in red for you at the time
Right.
you're being asked. I mean, at the time I was being asked, it was kind of like a casual question.
Mm-hmm.
which I responded in a casual way. But in fact, it was not a casual moment. It was a key moment. And those moments don't always announce themselves.
Right.
So
Sometimes
you
they're
need to be
disguised.
listening. Yes, they're
Yeah.
disguised. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, definitely. So to put this theme into more context, you're also a visual artist among the many things you do at Menlo College. And you
Mhm.
mentioned it earlier, but you supported yourself for a short period
Mhm.
just on your artwork, right?
Yes, yeah.
And so what was the highlight of that experience for you? If you want to go into other details too, please share.
Sure. Well, one part of I'll say that the supporting myself on the art, which directly related to money, um, had, I think, a lot to do with circumstance. In that I was living at that time. I was living abroad. My living expenses weren't high, and so even though I didn't make huge amounts selling my work, I could sell enough of it to support myself. And also, I happened to be in a circumstance where I had access to, for whatever reason, commercial galleries that were willing to sell my work. It was a period when, this is when I was in Poland, when collectors were coming from Berlin, particularly, and they were looking for art produced in that region because it was considered to be a good investment. So there were just a number of factors that worked to my advantage. But I would say that that's different than, was part of your question is or was, what is the highlight of engaging in visual art? And I think, and to add to that, since then, and certainly I sell work on occasion, and probably the total amount of money I make selling work is higher than when I was living off of it. But everywhere I've lived, in New York or here, living expenses are so high that, and until your work is at that level, you can't pay for your home or other things we enjoy like food. So,
Right. Just enjoy.
but the part of making art that is engaging for me is what might traditionally have been called the studio practice. And this is the engaging in the thinking about work, engaging in the thinking about creating work. For contemporary work, a large part of what artists do is they create work in response to contemporary culture. And with many of our roles in life, talking about wearing different hats, there are constraints on what's appropriate. If you have an idea at a college about something, there are certain parameters in which, if you have an idea about creating something, there are certain parameters you should use to make sure you retain your job. But if you have something that's a little wacky, that's not scientific, that doesn't seem quite appropriate for another context, it can always be appropriate in an art context. And I think that's why we end up having, at the moment, you have artists that, maybe they have some background in the sciences, but they're pursuing a kind of research that's not necessarily scientific. You would never get it peer reviewed, but it provides insight in a different way. And it's that kind of freedom that I enjoy in a visual art practice, because I am primarily a visual artist, not a conceptual artist. As I mentioned before, most of the work I do is painting. I've practiced painting, and it seems to be what I go back to. And I do have a weakness for pigment and colors, just from a pure aesthetic standpoint. I really do enjoy working with pigment, but it's more the conceptual side that gives me a broader sense of freedom. And one aspect of what I'm doing currently is I'm in a collaboration with a Dutch artist, Andre Decker. And a lot of what we're doing is facilitating other people's creation. So that also, there's a great amount of enjoyment in that and helping others create work. Does that,
Definitely. It sounds
yeah?
like it's very much we all call it a creative outlet, right? It's something that you
Mhm.
can after you're done with all that work for the day, as we were discussing before the interview, just somehow is so huge, even though we're all we're all sheltering in place. You're able to, at least any of those quirky ideas, as you said, that you couldn't apply directly to the writing center or the intensive English program, you can put them somewhere else. And I think that kind of the freedom you were talking about and thinking and pursuing a different kind of research is one of the things that is so valuable about art, and why there are pushes to support it more in society. Which makes me think, I mean, what decade, if you don't mind sharing, were you in Poland?
Early 90s.
So just after the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything.
Right.
And I
Just
think
after that.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, circumstances is important to take into context. That was such a very special time for that time of the world too, because
Yeah.
it was the first time you were probably able to even go to Poland. And it definitely, there was so much more potential, I think, and maybe still, for artists in particular to be able to live more comfortably, because you had different support mechanisms, different value of what that means.
Yes, I think there's some truth to that. And for many years, artists have been in Berlin for that reason.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It has provided them a chance to live more cheaply and also engage in a practice. And that's, you brought up a good point there about maybe the difference between kind of and this can refer to any kind of, let's say, pastime. The difference between something as a creative outlet and a professional activity. And I think it's worthwhile for areas in which one has a deep interest. Let's say it's either music or visual art, as I'm doing, or it could be something else. It could be writing. We'll probably talk a little more about writing. It's probably healthy, if you have a deep interest, to educate yourself and to see, well, what does it take to be engaged in this professionally? I mean, what steps would need to be taken to only do this? And what are for some of these practices, not many individuals are in that position. There's not particularly in the United States, we don't have the idea of a professional artist that is just kind of a day-to-day professional artist. It's
Right.
Either you're making work and not selling a lot of it, or a very small percentage of people are like an Ed Bruchet or somebody who are making millions off their work. But that middle area, and this is the problem in our culture as a whole, I think, the middle ground is lost, right? I think it's can tie to what's happened to the middle class in the country as well, right? That you have.
Yes. I completely agree, at least.
You have a very wealthy class and then not much in the middle.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, right? Because we need to either adapt to our circumstances and make them work for us so that we can eat, the thing we enjoy. Or you have to be working on changing them somehow. And even that just can be such an uphill battle sometimes. So I think you're absolutely right that if it's something you do enjoy, find some means of incorporating it into your professional life, whether that means you find another job that helps you do that, or maybe you find a different kind of work setup, a part-time job, whatever it is that you don't enjoy doing as much, but it doesn't require you to be in a salaried position where your days can be 8 hours a day, or they can be more, so that you actually have time to engage in that more fully.
Yes. And, and I think there's also room to be ambitious. I think about Rubens, for example, is a historical example. I often think about him for motivation. People who have multiple careers, they just, he was a statesperson, even a spy for his country, and also a professional artist. So I think some of it has to do with not giving up on grand ambition.
Right. Absolutely. I'm going to pivot a little bit to the next question. Well, if you want to talk, do you want to say anything else to what that experience was like for you as you supported yourself as an artist, or we can delve into the other.
I guess if we have time, I have one more example to give.
Sure. Yeah.
Because I was thinking a little bit about the good enough culture. I think this happens in Silicon Valley a bit, and I sometimes associated with Facebook or something like that, where get it done good enough and move on. And I think that works for many things, like parallel parking.
Oh boy. Not me. I'm always trying it like 3 times. I'm a horrible parallel parker. So.
But if you get it in the space and you don't hit the other cars, and
I guess there's margins, sure.
You're an inch further away from the curb than you want to be, fine. That's good. But I think there are other areas that we should each identify for ourselves where good enough is not good enough, and you really want to. You have a vision, and you should try to reach that vision as completely as possible. And so I was just going to give one example from. I was showing in a number of galleries at one point, and for one show, it was a little rushed. Give yourself enough time. So there were both technical issues and conceptual issues with the work when I finished it. I looked at it and went, oh, I didn't get there all the way conceptually. I can see how I would redo this. And then there were just some technical problems with the construction of the supports for the work. And I also did not have time to rectify those. So it was a real, I don't quite know what I could have done except have finished earlier.
Sure.
But it was one of those moments where, it was 90% there, but it wasn't there. And I don't know, with that gallery, things didn't go much further than that show, and it may or may not have been related to those issues. But for me, it was definitely a problem. Mm-hmm. And so it's, somehow I remember that more vividly than the shows that went well, where I was happy with everything. But that is a negative example. Was just really reminded me, one, give yourself enough time. And if you're 90% there and something you really care about, you're not there. Even if it means start over. You will not be happy.
Yeah.
So that was a little example I wanted to give.
Well, it's a good lesson, right? That's why it sticks out in your memory. So, I've learned something here.
Yes.
So tell us, Erik, more about, as a writer, you're the director of the Writing Center.
Right.
And also the director of the intensive English program. So one of my questions is, how do these go hand in hand? I was thinking, well, I have some thoughts, but I'll let you.
All right, good. Well, I look forward to hearing some of your questions or thoughts. Maybe they're not questions. Well, in New York, as I mentioned, I had a number of jobs, and I worked as a writer, and I was a managing editor for a number of publications. So I did a lot of writing, and I worked with a lot of writing. And there's nothing quite as humbling as publishing a magazine on deadline. It really teaches you what you can do in 24 hours, which is an amazing amount, but also what limitations look like. So that's kind of my background when I talk about professional writing. The connection, the thread, I would say, between professional writing, student writing, the Writing Center, and the intensive English program, we can maybe sum up with this phrase that has been attributed to a number of authors, and that is, writing is rewriting. And this idea that if you're going to write well, or you're going to learn a language, or you're going to effectively learn as a student, that you need to be involved in a process of engaged iteration. That's what connects all of these. It's never, unfortunately, the case that you stop being a student writer and suddenly you just write. It's the same process. And this is the same for students learning English, as I mentioned. And then the trick as an educator is, how do you attract students to this idea, to be active participants in engaged iteration, in rewriting, to make it their own? Because if you tell somebody that and they don't buy it, it doesn't make any sense. But once somebody adopts it, then they're pretty much good to go on their own.
Adopts their voice, or?
No, adopts the idea that writing is rewriting, and
Yes.
that you need to engage in iteration, and that you're just, this is what it's about.
Practicing and redefining.
Yes, this is part of living a meaningful life, is doing the same thing again and again, but doing it differently.
Sure. And can you maybe draw the connection between understanding that as a writer and growing in your own writing and learning a new language?
Sure. Part of that is, I was going to mention this before in talking about rigor, and I think this is a good time to mention it now, was this relates to many contexts. Part of its removal of, well, we use the kind of the cliche form to this, the removal of ego, removing yourself from the process a little bit. There's certain things that need to happen. You need to look at your text as if you didn't write it. And you need to be, speaking of rigor, you need to be highly critical. But in order to do that, you can't be emotionally attached to your production. You need to be able to say, okay, this isn't there, this isn't there, this isn't really what I wanted to say. I need to cut this. This I can start to work with a little more and tease it out. And it's the same with learning languages. And in high school and at university, I was kind of lousy at learning languages. I got better at it because you have to give up on the idea of shame, and you just have to be willing to try it and know that you are going to mess it up, and then try it again, and then try it again, and try it again. And it's hard to do that, but it's part of the process, like I said, of removing yourself, keeping yourself a bit of a distance, at a bit of a distance, so you can do the work that needs to be done to learn.
That's really interesting. Are you fluent or near fluency in any other languages besides English?
No. But I was closer at one time. At one time, I studied French for many years, and my reading in French was pretty good. And there was a moment where I was practicing conversation a bit more. And I could go to Paris and I could talk to people, and the highest compliment I ever got was in a Paris hotel when someone said to me, "Oh, you conjugate your verbs." That
Oh
was
my
like
gosh.
a fist pumping moment for me. But
That's funny.
I have dabbled in some other languages, but I would not say I'm fluent in any of them.
I don't know if you got to this point in French, and some people are much better at German and other languages than I am, and they think I'm crazy. Other people know exactly what I'm talking about, but there comes a point, at least this is what I and a handful of other people have experienced, where it's almost like you're accessing a different part of your personality, and
Mm-hmm.
and there's like a different component of you that opens up once you've gotten to a certain point in another language. That's quite incredible. And I'm just thinking about that in terms of, I don't know if I ever got there in my writing actually with German,
Right.
because most of what I was writing was academic, for one thing. And you can have an academic voice, but for the most part, I was very much just trying to get across information and bits of analysis. So I don't know if I ever got to really having a writing voice in German. And it's kind of it's a different thing when you're speaking to. I don't know how exactly to describe it. I'd probably have to think about it for hours.
I think I think it relates quite directly to the intensive English program at Menlo and what students struggle with. And one of the struggles that students have is that they have access to translating tools now that enable them to do a lot of work kind of on the side without high levels of engagement. And they can produce material that addresses prompts, but they're very far from what you're talking about, which is kind of living inside the language, thinking in the language, responding to your own thoughts in that language, which if you want to be an active, fluent participant, that's where you need to get. So I try to work with students and help them understand that for our purposes, even if their response, let's say, to a prompt is not as slick as it looks to them if it comes out of the translator, if they're using the English and practicing the English that they in fact know, that they have a relationship to, it's doing them a lot more good.
Absolutely.
So that's a struggle of teaching, particularly now. I mean,
Yeah.
they have options.
And not to make everything about getting employed, but what we have certainly seen students get to the point where they're supposed to be looking for internships, and their knowledge of English is somewhat concerning. It's not, it's once in a while, and so it doesn't. The translation tools that are out there are so helpful for a number of different contexts. It's so nice when I'm trying to research different universities and I can translate the page because I have no idea how to speak the language, and I shouldn't need to know how to speak 100 languages or hundreds, but they can. But if you really want to, as you're saying, get to know the language, if you want to get to know the culture that you're in, it's important to develop just as you said, develop your own relationship with that language.
And like you were saying, in terms of looking for employment, people, unless you're working, let's say you're applying for a job where there's another kind of technical expertise that is needed, well, people will probably look at that first. But if you're a generalist, if you're just being hired for general purposes like an internship, people have prejudices too. And even if they can equally understand you, if someone else is more free with the language and seems to have a deeper relationship with it, they will lean towards that person. So I think it's also true for, it's true across the board, but there are certainly advantages of, and this is something it doesn't refer just to languages as in our spoken language and our written language, but you can think of companies have their own language, they have their own environments. There are other cultural situations where and maybe you don't want to be part of these cultural contexts, but definitely different cultures have different ways of speaking about their culture and their work and their life. And if you want to engage in these cultures or in these work environments, it behooves you to learn the language of the culture if it really interests you. Maybe you'll start learning the language of the culture, like the language of Facebook, move fast and break things, and you realize, no, that doesn't interest me. But if you want to determine that, you need to know the language, as you say, and then when you know the language, you know the culture. Right.
So kind of going back to the writing part, and in the interest of time, if you don't mind maybe a shorter shorter example. I'm not trying to put a
No. I'm I pause and speak slowly. So
no. We're at the hour, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. But we would love to hear a bit about any of the writing that you do outside of work. And it sounds like you do something because you mentioned scientific writing at some point.
yes, though I don't engage that. Though I mean, if I had if I had a parallel universe to live in, that would be a career that would interest me.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's not one that I'll be pursuing this lifetime, unless something happens. Anyway, I do though. I do get requests to write about artists for galleries. I have connections still in New York, and I do that, and that's professional writing. They say, "Will you write about blah blah?" And I say, "Sure." And how many words? Sure. And then I do that. I also wrote, like I mentioned, many short reviews for art magazines for a good number of years. I became less interested in writing short reviews. I became more interested in longer pieces. And as a part of that, I started my own kind of on the very far on the side magazine called Aftershock Magazine, which is still there, aftershockmagazine.com. And this project gets neglected and then revived and then neglected again. But it's a place where, for example, if I write a 40-page review, speaking of length, of a single exhibition, which I did not so long ago, I can publish it there and I don't need to worry, even though it should be edited. I can explore this form. It's a way for me to explore this long form. And it's not the kind of writing anyone's going to pay me for, particularly when they're paying by the word.
Right.
And then I was speaking about collaborating with this Dutch artist. I'm working on a project. Part of our production, part of the quote art production of that project are written reports. So these reports inform people about what we're doing, but we consider them also kind of artwork that's coming out of this project. So there's an answer.
All right. Yeah, there's quite a few projects you have in the fire then. Pots in the fire, whatever that saying is. Pots
irons.
Thank you. So Erik, we have one question that we really like to ask all of our guests. I'm thinking maybe actually a question about what would your career be in a parallel universe should be another one. I really like that question. I would be a marine biologist.
Oh,
maybe. But
you can still do that.
Oh God, I'm not. Let me tell you, I didn't start in the sciences, and there's a reason. And it's not because science was first period every year in high school. And a coincidence. It's more than that. But so what we do like to ask is, what are you reading now or listening to or watching that you think should be shared?
Okay, I wrote some of this out because I didn't want to forget anything, but I'll stick to books mostly. And I recently finished the novel Machines Like Me by Ian McEwan, fairly recent. I would recommend this to everyone. I've been reading a little bit Virginie Despentes, who's acquired taste. I don't recommend her for everybody. But I did want to recommend Katie Flynn, who had one of my jobs prior to my having it. Katie Flynn was the director of the Writing Center here at Menlo. And she left in part to spend more time with her children, but specifically to work on her writing career. And she's done quite well. So she has a novel out that got discussed in the New York Times under pandemic literature called The Companions, which coincidentally is about people sheltering in place, written prior to all of this. But so I'd recommend that. And then for kicks, it came up in conversation. I went back to Confederacy of Dunces because it's funny, and I have only read it in parts, so I wanted to read it all the way through. And then for the summer, I have 2 nonfiction books on the list: Exercise as Medicine by Judy Foreman, and Tending the Wild, Native American Knowledge and the Management of California's Natural Resources by M. Cat Anderson. Now, one of the themes of this book is that when Westerners, came to California or to the United States and they saw this pristine wilderness. What they were actually looking at was a tended wilderness, one that had been maintained by the peoples that lived here. So they were not seeing it as it would have been had nobody lived here. So
that is interesting. Yeah.
that's one of the starting points of this book.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your review of that one, and then maybe I will borrow it.
It's on my Kindle, so I'll have to figure out how to.
Oh,
how to
okay.
share.
Well, I'll find a way.
Can you loan books? I don't know. I don't know if you can loan books or not.
That's a great question. Well, Erik, I've had a really great time chatting with you today, finding out a little bit more about you, your career journey, your side projects and hobbies, your philosophy on a number of different matters. So thanks so much for joining us today. This has been really great.
No, it's my pleasure. Nice to talk to you, Kelly.
And that's going to be all, folks. So as per usual, you can find links to our podcasts on the Menlo College Career Services blog. That's blog.menlo.edu/career-services/. Have a great day.